Hello and welcome to the Work and Wellbeing Podcast. My name is Eileen Donnelly, and today we're going to be talking about the rather sensitive subject of suicide, because this week is National Suicide Prevention Week, and within the week we also have World Suicide Prevention Day. Now, we spend most of our waking hours as adults at work. So the culture, the leadership style, work demands, workload all contribute to our mental health, whether that's good or bad. So it makes sense, therefore, for us to see suicide not just as a health issue, but actually as a workplace issue as well. Because our leaders can play a role, and our managers in particular, in potentially spotting the signs of someone not being okay and struggling. And we want to encourage people to be aware of their colleagues in the workplace as well as their team too. So I'm joined by Jeremy, and Jeremy is going to be telling us about his personal lived experience of suicide. So Jeremy, thank you for joining me today. And before we begin and get really into the detail, perhaps just tell us a little bit about yourself and about your journey.
Okay, Eileen, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. Before I start, just you raise a very interesting point about the amount of time that people spend in the workplace and how that can impact on people's mental health. We should also bear in mind that sometimes people who are struggling mentally, the causes of their mental illness or health are sometimes outside of the workplace, but it impacts them in such a way that they carry that through to the workplace, and it can still impact performance, etc. So it's not always work related. However, because of the amount of time, as you say, that we spend at work, employers still have an opportunity to help.
And that makes so much sense, particularly in this day and age when so much of our working lives for many people are actually in the home. So those boundaries have really become quite blurred. But of course, even if we're not at home when we're in our work environment, of course, there is almost no differentiation, I guess. You take your personal troubles into work and you take your work troubles into the home.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. So, where do I begin with my story? I always considered my childhood really normal, and there were no indications that I was going to suffer with any mental illness at all. There was no history of it in the family. Growing up in the 60s and 70s, I considered my upbringing to be perfectly normal for the day. However, when I started work, I soon came to realise that maybe things weren't as good as I'd imagined them to be. I spent a lot of time working overseas, and whilst it was a great experience for a young lad to be paid to travel the world, it also was accompanied by a great deal of loneliness. And spending weeks living in hotels, no matter what part of the world I was in, weeks at a time living in a hotel, the novelty of that soon wears off. But what struck me about that was how lonely I felt. And for me, that loneliness, I think, was the start of my journey into depression, because I had nobody to talk to, nobody to listen to how I was feeling. And if I'm honest, I used the facilities in a hotel, like the hotel bar, as a means of coping. And I know alcohol is not the best way of looking after yourself. But it was also at a time when I was acutely aware that men don't talk about their mental health. One of the things that I do remember about my childhood, as I was growing up, was at the age of about 6 or 7, I had to stop playing with girls, as we all did. You know, the boys would go and start playing football, and the girls would go and start playing doctors and nurses and their kitchen stuff. And I think one of the impacts of that is emotionally, boys were told, you don't cry. And so if I fell over and hurt myself, I would be told, boys don't cry, man up. And all those damaging phrases that we are so conversant with these days. And I think for me and my generation, that was a big steer in not talking about how we feel and the untold damage that can do. So I spent about 10 years working overseas, missed lots of family events because of that. And all the while, I could just sense that my mental health was deteriorating, just bit by bit. Nothing drastic, but just that gradual deterioration. But I just felt completely unable to talk to people, even to a doctor. I couldn't tell the doctor how I was feeling because I was fearful of that getting back to work or my wife finding out about it. And they were two big risks that I couldn't afford.
So in terms of, I mean, this is a long time, traveling for 10 years. Are you saying that you felt that loneliness and potentially the onset of depression for that length of time?
The sense of loneliness probably started to appear probably within about 12 months of travelling. Because, as I say, when you're living in hotels, one hotel is very much like another. So I could be in America or I could be in the depths of India. It didn't really matter. Hotel life is very, very lonely. You sit there and you have your meal and it's a real case of what do I do next? Do I go to my hotel room and spend the rest of the night there on my own? Or do I sit in a hotel bar on my own? You know, so loneliness is quite a prevalent issue.
And to what extent you talk about not being able to open up to people about it, your wife, the doctor, to what extent were you yourself aware? You talk about the fact that now you realise your mental health was deteriorating. Did you have that vocabulary back then to sort of be able to recognise it yourself? Did you know that was happening?
I think it took me a few years to recognise it. But once I recognised it, in a way that probably made it worse. Because of the stigma associated with mental illness. And in a way that kind of fed my silence and my inability to talk. And I wish things had been different. I wish that I had got the confidence to talk to people, because had I had that confidence, I would have saved myself and my family an awful lot of grief further down the line.
And how did you start to recognise the signs that it was probably getting to quite a severe level of depression? What kind of changed for you?
I was very aware that I was becoming really withdrawn from people, and started to almost live like a dual life. So I was having to put on a face that the outside world would see, the happy-go-lucky Jeremy, when internally I was actually being torn to shreds.
So would
mentally.
people not have been able to tell? Did you put a lot of energy into that?
A massive amount of energy, huge amount, which in itself is draining, because I had to remember what I had told people the year before or the month before or the week before, so as not to get caught out. So it took an awful lot of effort to maintain that facade.
And at this point, you were, how many years in were we now?
I'd probably got to about 15 years by that stage,
Okay.
and it was still deteriorating, and the symptoms were starting to worsen. So I recognised in myself that I was depressed, not only with the withdrawal from people, but the mood changes, poor sleep, alcohol consumption, all the typical symptoms that you would associate with a mental illness. But the frightening part for me was that I was really starting to feel worthless and hopeless.
So what part did work play in this for you? I mean, obviously this goes across all aspects of your life, but in the workplace, how was this presenting? Were you able to hide it from everyone at work as well?
I could manage to hide it, and did so really successfully. Not that I'm proud of that, but I did manage to do it. And I always felt that my performance at work was really dire. I was conscious that I was making mistakes and was having to spend a lot of time putting those mistakes right, because I couldn't risk other people seeing those mistakes and then picking me up on the mistakes that I was making. And in a way, it was almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I thought I was making mistakes, so I started to make mistakes and then started to have to put more effort. Did I really need to? Yes, but not to the extent that I was trying to create the right good performance.
Was there any support within work that you might have been able to access quietly, anonymously, because of course at this point colleagues didn't know? Was there anything you could have done for support at that point?
There were things that were available. There was occupational health that I could have gone to. This was before the time of employee assistance providers, so we didn't have that luxury. So any support I was going to get was going to have to come through a occupational health referral. But initially I was still reticent to go because there was always the risk that occupational health would have to share what they knew about me with my doctor.
Tell me about the stigma, because this is clearly a huge, huge barrier.
The stigma for me, I believed, was going to be career ending. That if people knew that I was ill and that I was struggling, then the opportunities to travel, the opportunities for promotion would end. Because how could they send somebody who was living with depression to the other side of the world for 2 months without any care plan in place? What would it do to my promotion prospects? And all these things were going through my mind. And to protect myself and to protect my income and to protect my family, I just found it easier, not painless, but easier to say nothing.
So where did this go?
This is where it gets to the hard bit because, as I mentioned, I started to feel a degree of hopelessness about life and I felt worthless. And it reached the stage where I started to feel that life wasn't worth living and that both myself and my family in particular would be better off if I was dead, frankly. And so eventually I started to think more and more about suicide, not because I wanted to die, but I merely wanted the pain and the anguish that I lived with to cease. And it was so painful to live with that anguish, day in, day out. So yeah, I started thinking and planning my suicide. And I thought about all the various methods that I might use and researched it pretty comprehensively. And that led me down the path. And I suppose those thoughts of suicide and the planning of it probably went on for maybe 2 or 3 years in its own right. Because maybe I hadn't reached the stage where I was actually going to enact it, if that makes sense. And I got some comfort, I suppose, out of knowing that if I need to, I can put an end to this. So I knew what I was going to do, and I knew where I was going to do it. The timing of it was completely spontaneous.
It sounds, the way you describe it, it sounds very clearly this wasn't about dying. This was about a release from pain,
Yep.
an escape from a life that was just too painful.
Yes.
Was there any point in this journey so far that you had any medical intervention at all?
I did have some medical intervention because I did go to occupational health after having a breakdown at work. I sat in my office one day and just cried. And it was a wake-up call, and I went to see occupational health, who referred me to a psychiatrist, which was all done privately. And I am grateful for that. I was at a stage when I wasn't ready to properly engage. And so I went into it not really accepting what the psychiatrist was trying to do with me. And there was always that barrier that I still had, partly because of the stigma, but partly because I was still afraid of my wife finding out.
So your wife didn't know at this
Still
point?
had no idea. No idea whatsoever.
What did you think might happen?
Worst case scenario, I thought she would leave me. And how wrong can I be? When you are in the depths of a mental illness, the reality of the world goes out of the window. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't behave correctly. And my sense of reality became completely distorted. And I thought the worst about all eventualities. I was going to lose my job. I was going to lose my wife and family just because of a mental illness. And they were key drivers for keeping it quiet.
So the counselling, the psychiatrist, unfortunately didn't work. Did that cease? How many sessions, weeks did that go on for?
I saw the psychiatrist monthly for a year. He'd prescribed medication for me, which wasn't perhaps the right medication, but he could only go with what he was familiar with and what he felt was going to be appropriate. And he did have to tell my GP at the end, because this was all being done privately. Private prescriptions are extraordinarily expensive, and I couldn't afford monthly prescriptions, and he wasn't going to prescribe medication on a longer term because of the risk of overdosing and all that was associated with it. So I was referred to my GP, who then took over day-to-day care. It's fair to say that elements of the therapy and the medication worked, and I had a period of improvement, even stability to a great extent. Lasted probably about a year, 18 months. But there was no discernible change in my outward appearance, my outward behaviours, because again, I couldn't suddenly show the world that I'm so happy, and so there was that consistent deadpan, I suppose, if you like, as to how my life went on. But about 18 months of slight improvement and a bit of stability.
So work provided this for you.
Yes.
Was there anything else that work did at that point?
They didn't, in fairness, because they really felt that they had done all they could with the referral to the psychiatrist, who reported back to occupational health, who will have reported back to my line manager that I was attending, I was taking the medication, I was showing signs of improvement. Suicidal thoughts had disappeared to a great extent. So there was that improvement.
What could your line manager have done, do you think? Was there anything?
I think hindsight is a wonderful thing, but hindsight can also be very cruel. If only people could talk to me, and I could talk to people. Partly my own fault, because I'd kept it a secret from people for so long. But had people who knew that I was struggling been able to have a conversation with me, my line manager. But we lived in a day where people didn't know what to say. And it's almost as though they'd picked up that hot potato and they'd given it to somebody else and said, here we go, you deal with it. And all they wanted to know was, am I fit for work? And turn up and do my job. But it would have been great to have had that conversation, to let somebody else know how I was feeling and what was going on.
Because you'd carried so much pressure and weight for so long.
Yes.
To be able to open up at the point when occupational health now know, you're now seeing a psychiatrist, you're on medication. So to some extent it had opened up a little bit.
Yes.
But there's still that culture within the organisation, albeit a few years ago now, so hopefully things are starting to change. But it sounds like, to some extent, this really could have made quite a difference for you if you'd had the support from people within the workplace itself.
Massively. And the evidence for that is that my mental health deteriorated once more after that sort of 18-month period of stability. And the thoughts of suicide resurfaced, and bearing in mind now that I'm under the care of the GP only, so there was no psychiatric input into my care. And when the thoughts of suicide came back, they were more serious than the first time around. And I had my plan in place. So I knew what I was going to do, where I was going to do it. And I mentioned earlier about the timing being spontaneous. I had a bad day at work. And when I look back, do you know what? It was nowhere near as bad as I thought it was. But at the time, it was as though my world had just collapsed. And I made the decision there and then that I shall end my life, die by suicide that day, and that I wouldn't be going home. But the input that followed that suicide attempt from psychiatric services and from occupational health and from my line manager, the contrast was unbelievable. Because by this time, we're talking probably maybe 6-7 years after the original psychiatric treatment, people at work, mental illness had started to become more popular, if you like, in the workplace. So there was more training taking place. There was more awareness of mental illness in the workplace. People were more willing to have those conversations. And it was a great relief that when I finally got back to work after the suicide attempt, I was able to start having serious conversations with people. I didn't feel at all embarrassed about what I'd done. Some people did, and sort of tiptoed around the word suicide. But eventually we got there and they used the word, what did it feel like? Pretty dreadful, actually. But so having those conversations, it was such a relief, such a relief.
I mean, to just be able to be very honest about how you're feeling and to some extent, just who you are at work must be such a relief.
Yes. I will say, though, it has to go much beyond just the workplace, because bearing in mind, my wife and family knew nothing about how ill I was.
Yeah. So I was going to ask about this.
Yeah.
So obviously they found out. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Basically, Michelle found out the night I attempted suicide. She had a phone call from the police to say that they'd found me and that I was unconscious and I was being taken off to hospital. And I am acutely aware of the emotions that it caused, because Michelle was very hurt that I could have done something so drastic. She also felt very guilty because Michelle was a nurse and felt that she should have been able to spot the signs. But I didn't give her that chance to spot that. And true, yeah, she felt very angry that I could have done something that potentially was going to cause so much hurt and material damage to both her and our 2 children. So there was a whole raft of different emotions that Michelle was experiencing. What I do have to say, for the record, is that Michelle has been absolutely amazing. She has been there by my side throughout my recovery. She is fully aware of all the work I do around suicide prevention and training of suicide first aid. And in all the years that followed that suicide attempt, because it's coming up to 15 years now since my suicide attempt, she has never, ever criticised me for it. I've hurt her deeply and badly, but she's never, ever criticised me.
She is an incredible woman.
Very.
So tell me more about your recovery.
My recovery was slow. I was off work for 6 months after the suicide attempt. I was under the care of the crisis team and then psychiatric outpatients, different psychiatrist, new medication, which worked wonders. And I saw my psychiatrist, started once a month, and then gradually sort of lengthened the periods between appointments. but saw the psychiatrist for 5 years, which in itself is quite amazing because normally psychiatrists go on rotation.
Right.
And so you get assigned a new psychiatrist. I don't know why, but he just wanted to keep me on his books. And so he saw me for 5 years. And we talked about the most random of things during the appointments, random things. For example, the war film, the classic First World War film, All Quiet on the Western Front. We spent most of one of my appointments discussing that because it was a film he'd never seen. And he went out and got the DVD to watch it. So we talked about the most random things, but he was an amazing guy. And we discussed a lot of aspects of my life. Some of the contributory factors, how to deal with some of the challenges that life throws. So sort of dipping into cognitive behavioural therapy. But sure enough, the recovery was quite slow because recovery from a mental illness is not like a physical illness where, you are ill, you start taking the medication and your recovery can be quite linear. With a mental illness, recovery tends to be quite up and down. So you will make progress, but you might take a dip. Recover a bit, a dip. As long as the trajectory is correct and you're going in the right direction with it, yeah. My recovery, it was 6 years before I was discharged from psychiatric care. Discharged because the psychiatrists felt I was no longer a risk to myself. They were happy with my state of mental health, so they were quite happy to discharge me. I was discharged with, like an open appointment. So if ever I felt the need, I knew that I could go back to them. And I talk about recovery and the fact that it's not linear. The last 2-3 years have been quite challenging. I can't put the reason as to why, but I have had 2 or 3 periods where I have become quite depressed and had a couple of periods, short periods, where I have felt the need to kill myself. The difference this time is that I knew that I had the support of my family and I knew that I could access psychiatric care very, very quickly. And that's what I've done. And so, yeah, I'm still going in the right direction, but there are blips. We all have blips in our state.
Yeah.
Overall, I'm pleased with the way it's going.
So tell me a little bit about what you do now for work and how that perhaps has been part of the recovery.
So about 8 years ago now, purely by chance, I was at an exhibition that I think you were at, actually. And I was asked about speaking to share my experience. So I did, and that started the journey of regularly sharing my story to organisations of all sorts, all different walks of industry, public sector, private sector, large companies, small companies, and then had the opportunity to train as being able to teach suicide first aid, mental health first aid. And I know that my reason for doing it is because of my own lived experience. But you know what? I wish I'd known about this years ago because I have never felt so fulfilled in my entire life. I wish it was something that I'd started years ago. I get so much out of it. Is it therapeutic? Of course it is. Because it keeps me grounded. It keeps me knowing what my journey has been, where I've come from and where I'm going to go to. And it's a stark reminder of the need to talk, the need to listen, and the need to support one another, really. And you can't do it on your own.
No. And I think that's such an important message that, we really want to emphasise to the listeners, but also to ask you if there was one thing that you could say to a workplace, to leaders, to managers, so that support is there, what would it be? You can say more than one thing. You can say as
Do
many
you know
as you
what
like.
I was going to say? Because one thing is really,
Yes.
really difficult. I think employers need to have an awareness of mental illness and suicidal ideation. They don't need to be able to fix the problems, but they simply need to have an awareness so that they can recognise the signs. They have the skills and the confidence to be able to ask the person and ask again and again, because you'll never get the right answer the first time of asking. And that you know how to listen without judgment. And that is a skill in itself. Listen without judgment and know how to signpost. They are the key things that an organisation can do.
Something that, with hindsight, cruel as it might be, would have been incredibly helpful for you.
Yeah, very.
Yeah.
Very.
And I just want one or two messages for anyone who perhaps is listening right now and feels that they may be there as well. They're in a lot of emotional pain. What's one thing that you would say to them?
To reach out and try and talk to somebody, initiate the conversation for yourself. Tell somebody that you are struggling and that you want to talk and get some help. And it is very, very difficult because of that fear of judgment. And we talk about reaching out and reaching in. They're both equally difficult. Asking somebody, are they thinking of suicide, is as difficult as me telling you out of the blue, I need to talk to you because I'm thinking of suicide. We need to encourage people that it's okay. Bad days and bad days that are so serious that they are thinking of doing something akin to suicide. Talk.
Amazing. Such an important message.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. An incredible conversation and one that is so important for us all to hear. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing that story with me. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Eileen.
Thank you very much for listening. And if, like me, you have found that conversation really valuable, then I do encourage you to subscribe, comment, like, and share. Now, if any of the content in that conversation has affected you, then please do reach out to Ripple or to the Samaritans on 116 123. And there's also lots of other support services in the show notes. So thanks for now, and we'll see you next time.